Why do both of my sons have the exact same scar I never noticed before? I was helping my younger son Ethan get dressed after his Saturday morning soccer game when I saw it. A thin, white line running diagonal across his left shoulder blade about 2 inches long. I asked him how he got that scar, and he shrugged and said he didn't know, that it had always been there. Something about the shape and position triggered a memory, and I called for my older son Lucas, who was watching TV in the living room. When he came into the bedroom, I asked him to lift his shirt and turn around. There it was, the exact same scar in the exact same location on his left shoulder blade, identical in length and angle and color. My hands started shaking as I stared at both boys standing side by side with matching scars I'd somehow never noticed in their 11 and 9 years of life. I asked Lucas when he got his scar, and he gave me the same answer Ethan had, that he'd always had it and didn't remember any injury. The statistical impossibility of 2 children having identical scars in identical locations from unknown causes made my stomach drop. My wife Rebecca was at her book club and wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, so I was alone trying to process this discovery. I'd given both boys hundreds of baths when they were younger and had seen them shirtless thousands of times. How had I never noticed these scars before? I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through photos, looking for any shots that showed their backs clearly. I found several from last summer's beach vacation where both boys were running toward the ocean and zoomed in on their shoulder blades. The scars were visible in the photos, faint, but definitely there. I'd looked at these pictures dozens of times and had never registered the marks. I went further back through the photo library, finding images from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. In every photo where their backs were visible, the scars were present. I'd been blind to something that had apparently existed for years. I asked the boys to sit with me on the couch, and I tried to stay calm while questioning them more thoroughly. Did they remember falling or cutting themselves on that exact spot? Had they been injured at the same time in some accident I'd forgotten? Lucas said he had no memory of any injury to his back, and the scar had just always been there as long as he could remember. Ethan nodded in agreement and said the same thing. I asked if their mother had ever mentioned how they got the scars, and both boys looked confused and said they'd never talked about it. The conversation felt surreal because I was discussing something that should have been part of our family history, but had somehow existed in a blind spot for everyone. I told them to go back to their activities, and I sat alone trying to figure out what I was missing. The scars were too identical to be coincidence. Same size, same location, same appearance. That meant they had to have been caused by the same thing at the same time. I called Rebecca and asked when she'd be home. She said another hour and asked if everything was okay. I told her I needed to talk to her about something strange I'd discovered about the boys. Her voice shifted to concern, and she said she'd leave early and be home in 30 minutes. I hung up and went back to studying photos, this time looking at baby pictures from when the boys were infants. I found shots from Lucas's first bath at 3 days old and zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The scar appeared to be there even then, though it was harder to see on infant skin. I pulled out physical photo albums from the closet and used a magnifying glass to examine pictures more closely. In every image where their backs were visible throughout their entire lives, the scars were present. That meant they'd been born with these marks or had received them very early in infancy before I'd formed clear memories of their bodies. Rebecca came home and found me surrounded by scattered photos in the living room. I showed her both boys' backs and watched her face change from confusion to shock as she registered what she was seeing. She said she'd never noticed the scars before and asked how that was possible. I told her I'd been asking myself the same question for the past hour. We sent the boys to play in their room and sat together going through the same photos I'd already examined. Rebecca kept saying she couldn't believe she'd missed something so obvious for so long. She was their mother and had been far more involved in their daily care than I had been, especially when they were very young. If anyone should have noticed matching scars, it was her. She pulled up photos on her own phone and found the same pattern I had, scars visible in every image but somehow never consciously registered. We decided we needed to check the boys' medical records to see if there was any documentation of injuries or procedures that might explain the marks. I called our pediatrician's office Monday morning and requested copies of both boys' complete medical files. The receptionist said it would take a few days to compile everything and asked if I wanted them mailed or if I'd pick them up. I said I'd pick them up and asked her to call me the moment they were ready. She asked if there was a specific concern, and I explained that both boys had identical scars we'd never noticed and were trying to figure out the origin. There was a pause before she said she'd flag the request as urgent and have the nurse review the files before I came in. Her tone shifted to something more serious, and I got the sense she thought I was describing something potentially concerning. I hung up feeling both relieved that someone was taking this seriously and anxious about what the records might reveal. Rebecca spent Monday afternoon calling relatives, asking if anyone remembered the boys being injured in a way that might have caused scarring. Her mother said she'd never noticed any scars on either boy. Her sister, who visited frequently, said the same thing. My own parents were traveling overseas and couldn't be reached immediately, but I left them a detailed message explaining what we'd discovered. Every conversation ended with the same confused response. Nobody had ever noticed these scars, despite years of seeing both boys in various states of undress. I started documenting everything in a notebook, writing down the exact measurements of each scar, the precise location, the color, and texture. I photographed both scars with a ruler for scale and under different lighting conditions. The marks were raised slightly and appeared to be keloid scars from deep cuts or surgical incisions. They were old enough to have faded significantly, but recent enough that they'd been made after birth. The pediatrician's office called Wednesday afternoon and said the files were ready. I drove over immediately and met with our regular nurse, a woman named Gloria Vasquez, who'd been seeing the boys since Lucas was born. She had both files open on her desk, and her expression was troubled. She said she'd reviewed every document in both files and found no record of any procedures, injuries, or treatments that would explain the scars. Both boys had been born via cesarean section at County Medical Center and had standard newborn care with no complications noted. Neither file mentioned any cuts, falls, or incidents requiring stitches or other wound care. Gloria said the scars appeared to be surgical in nature based on their clean, straight lines and similar healing patterns. She asked if I'd considered the possibility that something happened at the hospital before we brought them home that wasn't properly documented. The suggestion made my chest tighten because it implied our sons had been subjected to some kind of medical procedure without our knowledge or consent. I asked Gloria what kind of procedure would leave scars in that location, and she said she wasn't sure, but that I should contact the hospital's medical records department and request copies of all documentation from the boys' births and initial care. She printed out the contact information and said I should also speak to a medical malpractice attorney because if undocumented procedures had been performed, that represented a serious breach of protocol and patient rights. I drove home in a daze, trying to imagine what could have happened in those first days of my sons' lives that had left permanent marks on their bodies without anyone noticing or documenting it. Rebecca was waiting when I got home, and I showed her the files and relayed what Gloria had said. Her face went pale, and she asked if I thought our boys had been experimented on or harmed in some way. I said I didn't know, but we needed to find out immediately. I called County Medical Center Thursday morning and requested all records related to Lucas's birth in 2013 and Ethan's birth in 2015. The records clerk said I'd need to submit written requests with specific information, and that processing could take up to 30 days. I explained that I'd discovered both boys had unexplained surgical scars from infancy and needed the records urgently. The clerk's tone changed, and she transferred me to a supervisor who took down my information and said she'd expedite the request. She asked for photographs of the scars and said a hospital administrator would review the case personally. I emailed the photos immediately and spent the rest of the day researching medical malpractice cases involving undocumented procedures on newborns. What I found was disturbing. There were dozens of documented cases where hospitals had performed experimental procedures or used infants in research studies without proper parental consent. Most cases involved hospitals affiliated with medical schools where residents and researchers had access to patients. County Medical Center was a teaching hospital affiliated with the State University Medical School. Both boys had been born there because our insurance required it and because Rebecca's OB had privileges there. I started searching specifically for issues at County Medical Center and found several news articles from 2012 and 2013 about a research scandal involving unauthorized tissue sampling from newborns. The articles said hospital staff had been collecting small tissue samples from infants for a genetic research study without obtaining proper informed consent from parents. The study had been shut down and several researchers were disciplined, but the articles didn't specify what kind of samples were taken or how. I called the reporter who'd written the main article and explained what I'd discovered about my sons. He said he'd be interested in hearing more and suggested we meet in person. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown that evening. The reporter's name was David Nguyen, and he'd been covering the medical beat for the local paper for 15 years. He brought a folder of documents related to the County Medical Center scandal and spread them across our table. He explained that the unauthorized research had involved taking small skin biopsies from newborns' backs using a specialized punch biopsy tool that removed a circular piece of tissue about 5 millimeters in diameter. The samples were being collected for a study on genetic markers for childhood diseases, but the consent process had been inadequate, or in some cases, completely absent. The study had run from 2011 to 2014 before being discovered and shut down. David showed me photographs from the investigation showing the biopsy tools and documenting the types of scars they left. The scars were thin, straight lines identical to what I'd seen on my sons' backs. My hands started shaking as I realized what I was looking at. David explained that approximately 800 newborns had been subjected to these unauthorized biopsies during the 3-year period the study operated. Parents of affected children had been notified after the scandal broke, but he said there were persistent rumors that the hospital's notification list was incomplete and that some families had never been contacted. He pulled out a copy of the settlement agreement from the class action lawsuit that had been filed against the hospital. The families who'd been properly notified and joined the lawsuit had received $50,000 per child, plus ongoing medical monitoring. David said he'd been trying to track down families who should have been notified but weren't, because he believed the hospital had deliberately kept the affected patient list incomplete to minimize their financial exposure. He asked if I'd been contacted by the hospital or any lawyers about the biopsy study, and I said no, that I'd never heard anything about it until right now. I drove home and found Rebecca feeding the boys dinner. I pulled her into the bedroom and showed her the documents David had given me. She read through them with growing horror and asked why we'd never been notified if our boys had been part of this study. I said that was exactly what we needed to find out, and that I was calling a medical malpractice attorney in the morning. Rebecca asked if we should tell the boys what we'd discovered, and I said not yet, that we needed to understand the full situation first, before explaining to two young children that they'd been subjected to unauthorized medical experimentation as infants. We sat up until 2 a.m, reading through everything David had provided and making lists of questions we needed answered. The most pressing question was why our family had been excluded from the notification and settlement if our sons clearly showed evidence of the unauthorized biopsies. Friday morning, I called 3 medical malpractice firms before finding one willing to meet with me that same day. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in cases involving hospital negligence and research misconduct. I brought all the documentation I'd collected, including the photos of the boys' scars, their medical files, and the materials from David Nguyen. Patricia reviewed everything carefully, and then pulled up the court records from the class action lawsuit against County Medical Center. She said the settlement had been finalized in 2016 and that the notification list had included 734 families. She said, if my sons had been born during the study period and showed clear evidence of biopsy scars but we'd never been notified, that represented either gross negligence or deliberate exclusion. She asked if I'd saved any documents from the boys' births, and I said we had all their discharge paperwork and newborn care instructions at home. Patricia explained that I needed to obtain the complete hospital records for both births, including nursing notes, lab orders, and any documentation related to research, activities, or consents. She said once we had those records, we could determine definitively whether the boys had been part of the study and why we weren't notified. She offered to represent us on contingency and said if we could prove the hospital deliberately excluded us from the settlement, we could file a separate lawsuit for damages, plus whatever additional harm resulted from the delayed discovery. I signed the representation agreement, and Patricia immediately sent a demand letter to County Medical Center requesting all records related to both births within 7 days. She said hospitals typically delayed and obstructed these requests, but her letter specified that failure to comply would result in immediate court action. The boys asked why I'd been on the phone so much and acting stressed. I told them Rebecca and I were dealing with some paperwork issues related to their births that we needed to sort out with the hospital. Lucas asked if it had to do with their scars, and I was surprised he'd made the connection. I said yes, that we were trying to understand how they got those marks. He said some kids at school had been asking about it because they'd seen the scars during gym class. Another parent had apparently noticed and asked their kid about it. I felt a wave of anger that this situation was now affecting my sons socially because other people were noticing marks that their own parents had been blind to for years. I told Lucas the scars were from a medical procedure when he was a baby and that we were making sure everything had been done properly. He accepted this explanation and went back to his homework, but I could see he was worried. County Medical Center responded to Patricia's demand letter with a partial document production after 5 days. They sent basic birth records, but claimed that detailed nursing notes and research-related documents from 2013 and 2015 had been purged per their standard document retention policy. Patricia said this was obviously false because the hospital was required to maintain patient records for at least 10 years, and that research study documents should have been preserved indefinitely given the litigation. She filed a motion to compel production and asked the court to impose sanctions for the hospital's obstruction. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week. In the meantime, Patricia hired a private investigator to locate other families who might have been excluded from the original notification list and settlement. She said if we could find even a few other families, it would establish a pattern of deliberate exclusion rather than innocent oversight. The private investigator was a former FBI agent named Gordon Mills, who specialized in medical fraud cases. He started by analyzing the timeline of births during the study period and comparing it to the list of families included in the settlement. He found approximately 200 families who'd given birth at County Medical Center during the relevant time frame but weren't on the settlement list. He began systematically contacting these families to ask if their children had unexplained scars on their backs. Within 3 days, he'd found 12 families who reported discovering similar scars after his calls prompted them to check. None of these families had been notified about the research study or the settlement. All of them were furious when Gordon explained what had likely been done to their children. Patricia began organizing these families into a new class action lawsuit, alleging that County Medical Center had deliberately concealed the full extent of the unauthorized research and had excluded families strategically to minimize settlement costs. The emergency hearing about document production was contentious. County Medical Center's attorneys argued that demanding decade-old nursing notes was unreasonable and that whatever documents existed had been produced. Patricia presented evidence that the hospital maintained comprehensive electronic medical records and that the research study itself had required detailed documentation of every subject enrolled. She argued that the hospital's claim of purged records was demonstrably false and represented spoliation of evidence. The judge agreed and ordered the hospital to produce all records related to the research study and the births of my 2 sons within 10 days or face contempt charges and daily fines. The hospital's legal team looked shaken as they left the courtroom. Patricia said this was a major victory because it meant we'd finally get access to the truth about what happened. The records arrived 8 days later in 3 large boxes of printed documents and several DVD discs of digital files. Patricia and I spent an entire weekend reviewing everything in her office. What we found was damning. Both Lucas and Ethan appeared on enrollment logs for the genetic research study. Small tissue samples had been collected from both boys within 24 hours of birth using the punch biopsy technique. The samples had been labeled with study ID numbers and sent to the university research lab for processing. Consent forms in the files showed my wife's signature, but Rebecca swore she'd never signed any such forms and had never been told about any research study. Patricia compared the signatures to Rebecca's real signature from other medical documents and said they were obviously different. Someone at the hospital had forged Rebecca's consent to include our sons in the study. Even more disturbing was an internal hospital memo from 2016 after the scandal broke. The memo discussed the notification strategy for affected families and specifically mentioned excluding families where consent might be questionable or forged. The memo stated that notifying these families could expose the hospital to claims of fraud and assault, in addition to the research misconduct claims. The author of the memo had decided it was better to risk some families never discovering the truth than to proactively disclose the consent forgeries. The memo listed approximately 50 families in this category, and both Lucas and Ethan appeared on that list by their study ID numbers. Patricia said this memo alone proved deliberate concealment and fraud and would likely result in punitive damages far exceeding the original settlement amounts. I called Rebecca from Patricia's office and told her what we'd found. She started crying and said she couldn't believe the hospital had forged her signature and then deliberately hidden it to avoid accountability. She asked what we did now, and I said Patricia was filing an amended complaint adding fraud, forgery, assault, and intentional infliction of emotional distress to our claims. Patricia said we had one of the strongest medical malpractice cases she'd seen in her career because the evidence of deliberate wrongdoing was so clear. She estimated our case alone could be worth several $1 million in compensatory and punitive damages. She said the 12 other families Gordon had found would likely join our lawsuit, and that there might be dozens more families who'd been similarly excluded. The hospital's liability exposure could exceed $50 million once all the excluded families were accounted for. The local media picked up the story after Patricia filed the amended complaint. David Nguyen wrote a front-page article about the discovery of systematically excluded families and the forged consent forms. Other media outlets followed up, and suddenly County Medical Center was facing a renewed scandal 7 years after they thought the issue had been resolved. The hospital's CEO gave a press conference saying they took these allegations seriously and were conducting an internal investigation. Patricia said the press conference was damage control and meaningless without concrete action. She demanded the hospital immediately contact all families on the exclusion list and disclose what had been done. The hospital refused, saying they couldn't comment on pending litigation. Patricia filed a motion asking the court to order notification as a matter of public safety, since affected individuals might have ongoing health concerns related to the unauthorized biopsies. Rebecca and I decided we needed to tell Lucas and Ethan the truth about what had happened to them. We sat both boys down and explained in age-appropriate terms that when they were babies, the hospital had done a small medical test without properly asking our permission. We said the test had left the scars on their backs and that we were now working with lawyers to make sure the hospital took responsibility. Lucas asked if the test had hurt, and I said they'd been too young to remember, but yes, it probably had hurt. Ethan asked if we were mad at the hospital, and Rebecca said yes, that what the hospital did was very wrong, and we were making sure they'd never do it to other babies. Both boys seemed to accept. This explanation, though, Lucas asked several follow-up questions about what the test was for and whether the results had shown anything wrong with him. I assured him he was completely healthy and that the test had nothing to do with his well-being. The judge granted Patricia's motion and ordered County Medical Center to notify all families on the exclusion list within 30 days. The hospital appealed, but the appellate court upheld the order and added additional penalties for the hospital's continued obstruction. Notification letters finally went out 3 months after we'd filed our lawsuit. Within weeks, 43 additional families came forward, saying they'd received letters and had checked their children for scars matching the ones described. Patricia organized all these families into a coordinated litigation strategy. The hospital faced a catastrophic liability situation, with dozens of families demanding accountability and juries likely to be sympathetic given the egregious facts. Patricia said settlement negotiations would probably begin soon because no hospital could risk this going to trial with this much damning evidence. Settlement talks began 6 months into the litigation. County Medical Center initially offered $200,000 per child to resolve all claims. Patricia rejected this, immediately saying our case alone was worth millions given the fraud and forgery and that the hospital needed to take responsibility for the systematic concealment. The hospital increased their offer to $500,000 per child for all affected families. Patricia said this was closer to reasonable, but that we also needed admission of wrongdoing, policy changes to prevent future abuses, and funding for long-term medical monitoring of all affected children. The negotiations continued for 3 months with offers and counteroffers. The hospital was desperate to avoid trial, but also terrified of the precedent a large settlement would set for future medical research cases. During the settlement negotiations, I became obsessed with understanding exactly what had been done with the tissue samples taken from my sons. I contacted the university research lab that had processed the samples and requested information about the study under Freedom of Information laws. The university initially refused, but Patricia filed a motion compelling disclosure since the research had been conducted without proper consent. The university eventually produced the study protocols and results. What I learned made me sick. The tissue samples had been used to create cell lines that were then stored in a biobank for future research. Portions of my son's genetic material had been preserved and distributed to other researchers without any limitation or oversight. Their biological material had become research property that could be used indefinitely by scientists they'd never meet studying diseases they'd never have. I found out that several published research papers had used data derived from the cell lines created from Lucas and Ethan's tissue samples. The papers studied genetic markers for autism, childhood cancers, and developmental disorders. My son's genetic information had contributed to scientific knowledge, but entirely without their consent or our knowledge. Patricia said this opened up additional legal claims related to property rights in biological materials and genetic privacy. She said the unauthorized creation and distribution of the cell lines represented ongoing harm that continued long after the initial biopsies were taken. The university argued that the cell lines were anonymous and couldn't be traced back to specific individuals, but Patricia pointed out that genetic material is inherently identifiable and that the university had maintained records linking the cell lines to my son's names and birth dates. Rebecca became increasingly angry as she learned more details about what had been done. She said it felt like our sons had been violated in a way that couldn't be undone, that parts of them had been taken and distributed without permission and would exist in laboratories forever. She started having nightmares about the hospital and would wake up crying. I tried to be supportive while managing my own rage and helplessness. We both went to therapy to process the trauma of discovering that our children had been used as research subjects in their first days of life. The therapist helped us understand that what we were experiencing was a form of betrayal trauma, that we'd trusted the hospital to care for our vulnerable newborns, and that trust had been systematically violated for research purposes. Lucas started asking more questions about the lawsuit and what the hospital had done. He was old enough now to understand that something serious had happened, even if he couldn't fully grasp the implications. I showed him age-appropriate articles about medical research ethics and explained that doctors were supposed to ask permission before doing tests on people, and that the hospital had broken that rule. He asked if other kids at school might have the same scars, and I said it was possible since many of his classmates had been born at the same hospital during the same time period. He said he was going to start a club at school for kids who had scars from the hospital, and I didn't know whether to be proud of his initiative or heartbroken that he was defining himself partly by this violation. The settlement negotiations hit an impasse when the university refused to agree to destroy the cell lines created from the unauthorized biopsies. University lawyers argued that destroying the cell lines would eliminate valuable research materials and that the scientific work done using them shouldn't be erased. Patricia countered that the cell lines were stolen property created through fraud and assault and had no legal right to exist, regardless of their scientific value. The judge ordered mediation to resolve this issue specifically. The mediator was a bioethics professor who spent 6 hours listening to arguments from both sides before proposing a compromise. The cell lines would be maintained, but access would be severely restricted, and any future research using them would require specific approval from a committee that included representatives from the affected families. Neither side was happy with this compromise, but both accepted it as better than the uncertainty of trial. Gordon Mills continued investigating and eventually found 68 families who'd been excluded from the original notification and settlement. All of them had children born at County Medical Center during the study period with characteristic biopsy scars on their backs. The pattern of exclusion became clear as Gordon analyzed the demographics. The excluded families were disproportionately low-income, uninsured, or from minority communities. The hospital had apparently calculated that these families were less likely to have resources to pursue legal action if they discovered what had been done. Patricia said this added civil rights violations to our claims and made the hospital's conduct even more egregious. She filed an amended complaint on behalf of all 68 families seeking not just compensation, but systemic reforms to prevent similar targeting of vulnerable populations. The case attracted national attention as news outlets picked up the story of the excluded families and the demographic pattern of the exclusion. Medical ethics experts weighed in saying this represented one of the most serious research scandals in recent history because it combined unauthorized experimentation with deliberate concealment targeting vulnerable populations. Several medical journals published editorials calling for reforms to research oversight and consent processes. Professional medical organizations issued statements condemning the hospital's conduct. The political pressure on County Medical Center became intense as legislators called for investigations and threatened funding cuts if the hospital didn't take responsibility. The final settlement agreement was reached 18 months after I first noticed those matching scars on my son's backs. County Medical Center agreed to pay $750,000 per affected child, a formal public apology, implementation of new research oversight protocols, establishment of a $10 million medical monitoring fund for all children who'd been subjected to the unauthorized biopsies, and funding for a community health center in an underserved neighborhood to address the harm done to vulnerable populations. The settlement covered 68 families representing 94 children who'd been excluded from the original notification and settlement. The total payout exceeded $70 million, making it one of the largest medical research misconduct settlements in state history. Additionally, 3 senior administrators who'd signed the memo authorizing the exclusion strategy were forced to resign, and the hospital's research program was placed under enhanced state oversight for 10 years. Patricia said this sent a clear message to hospitals that concealing wrongdoing would cost far more than honest disclosure. and that targeting vulnerable populations for exploitation would face serious consequences. She said our persistence in investigating the boys' scars had uncovered a systematic cover-up and had brought justice for dozens of families who'd never have known what happened to their children. David Nguyen won a regional journalism award for his coverage of the case and wrote a book about medical research ethics using our case as the central narrative. The book helped raise public awareness about the importance of informed consent and the risks of research misconduct. Rebecca and I used part of the settlement money to establish college funds for both boys and donated a substantial portion to organizations working on medical research oversight and patient advocacy. We funded scholarships for students from underserved communities pursuing careers in medical ethics and bioethics. We wanted something positive to come from what had been done to our sons. The emotional healing took longer than the legal resolution. Rebecca needed 2 years of intensive therapy to work through her feelings of betrayal and violation. I struggled with anger and guilt, anger at the hospital and guilt that I hadn't noticed the scars sooner or protected my sons better. Lucas and Ethan processed the experience in different ways. Lucas became interested in science and medicine and said he wanted to become a researcher who did things ethically and helped people instead of hurting them. He read the book David had written and understood more about what had happened to him. Ethan was younger, and the details were more abstract to him, but he understood that something wrong had been done and that his parents had fought to make it right. Both boys remained healthy with no medical issues related to the biopsies. The scars faded further as they grew, but would always be visible reminders of what had happened. The community health center funded by the settlement opened 3 years after the case concluded. Rebecca and I attended the opening ceremony along with many of the other affected families. The center provided free medical care to underserved populations and included a patient advocacy office to help people navigate the healthcare system and understand their rights. A plaque in the lobby listed the names of all 94 children who'd been affected by the unauthorized research, a permanent memorial to what had been done, and a commitment that it would never happen again. Standing in that lobby surrounded by other families who'd been harmed and then brought together by their fight for justice, I felt something shift. The anger and pain didn't disappear, but they were joined by a sense of purpose and community. The hospital's research oversight reforms became a model that other institutions studied and adopted. The case was taught in medical schools as an example of research ethics violations and the importance of informed consent. Professional organizations updated their guidelines for research involving vulnerable populations. State legislators passed new laws strengthening penalties for research misconduct and requiring more rigorous consent processes. The ripple effects of what had started as a father noticing strange scars on his sons' backs had changed how medical research was conducted and overseen across the entire state and influenced practices nationally. 5 years after the settlement, Lucas was 15 and Ethan was 13. The scars were still visible, but had become part of their identities rather than sources of shame or mystery. Lucas gave a presentation at his high school about medical ethics and research oversight, using his own experience as the foundation. He showed his classmates his scar and explained how he'd been part of unauthorized research as an infant and how his parents had fought for accountability. The presentation inspired several students to pursue careers in medicine and bioethics. Ethan joined a youth advocacy organization that worked on patient rights issues and gave testimony to a legislative committee considering additional research oversight reforms. Rebecca and I had processed our trauma enough to begin volunteering with patient advocacy groups, speaking to other families who'd experienced medical misconduct and helping them navigate the complex legal and emotional aftermath. We shared what we'd learned about documentation, finding good legal representation, and managing the psychological impact of betrayal by trusted institutions. Every family we helped felt like partial redemption for what had been done to our sons. We couldn't change the past, but we could use our experience to help others fight for justice and accountability. The biobank containing the cell lines created from the unauthorized biopsies remained a source of tension. Despite the settlement restrictions, research using the materials continued under the Oversight Committee. I received quarterly reports about how the cell lines were being used and which studies they'd contributed to. Each report was a reminder that parts of my sons existed in laboratories and research papers, contributing to knowledge but existing because of violation. I'd made peace with this reality as much as possible, but it never felt completely resolved. Patricia said this was one of the unsolvable problems in modern medicine, that biological materials taken unethically couldn't be unethically taken back without destroying potentially valuable knowledge. County Medical Center rebuilt its reputation slowly over the years following the settlement. New leadership implemented genuine reforms and worked to restore community trust. The hospital established a patient advisory board that included representatives from affected families and gave real input on research protocols and patient care policies. I was invited to join this board and initially refused, not wanting ongoing contact with the institution that had harmed my sons. But Rebecca convinced me that participating would ensure the reforms were meaningful and would honor what we'd fought for. I served on the board for 3 years and saw firsthand how the culture had shifted from prioritizing research advancement over patient welfare to genuinely balancing both concerns. 10 years after discovering the scars, Lucas was 21 and in college studying biomedical ethics. Ethan was 19 and pursuing a degree in public policy with focus on healthcare reform. Both boys had taken what had been done to them and transformed it into purpose and direction. They'd been violated as infants, but had become advocates as young adults. They spoke publicly about their experiences and pushed for continued reform. The scars that had started this entire journey were now badges they wore with complex pride, symbols of survival and resistance and refusal to let injustice stand unopposed. I thought often about that Saturday morning, when I'd first noticed the matching scars, how a moment of parental observation had unraveled into discovery of systematic abuse and cover-up. I thought about all the small decisions that had led to accountability, calling the pediatrician, meeting with David Nguyen, hiring Patricia, refusing to accept the hospital's initial obstructions. Any one of those decisions could have gone differently and the truth would have stayed buried. 68 families would never have known what had been done to their children. The hospital would have successfully avoided accountability for their deliberate concealment. Medical research would have continued with inadequate oversight. The weight of those alternate timelines made me grateful that I'd noticed something that everyone else, including myself, had missed for years. A father's routine observation had become the thread that unraveled institutional betrayal and brought justice to nearly 100 children whose bodies had been used without consent or compensation. The scars would always be there, but so would the knowledge that they'd been noticed, investigated, and vindicated, transforming marks of violation into symbols of accountability, achieved through persistence and refusal to accept easy answers when harder truths demanded exposure. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.